The rushes crackled, a sound like old bones breaking under my bare feet. Each step toward the marriage bed was a splinter of ice in my soul. I was Margot, and I had seen 15 winters, though tonight I felt as if I had seen none at all, as if I were a newborn calf, slick and trembling, pushed into a world of wolves. The single tallow candle on the stool spat and hissed, casting Henrik's shadow against the wattle and daub wall, making a giant of him. He was a man carved from oak and earth, his face a map of 40 years of wind and sun, a landscape I was now bound to inhabit. My father had traded me for him, for 3 pigs and half an acre of good barley land. A fine price for a daughter, he'd said, his breath thick with the ale he drunk in celebration of his good fortune. My hands, slick with sweat, twisted the rough-spun wool of my shift. It was my mother's, and her mother's before her, a shroud passed down through a line of women who had walked this same path. The fabric smelled of lye, wood smoke, and a faint, almost metallic scent of old fear. Through the thin wall, the world was a cacophony of drunken joy. Henrik's friends, their voices slurred and raw, bellowed jests that made my cheeks burn. Wooden spoons beat a relentless, savage rhythm against iron pots and pans, a heartbeat for this ritual of violation. Clang, clang, clang. They were a jury waiting for evidence. They would not depart into the damp autumn night until they heard the sounds of my undoing, the proof that the deed was done, that the property had been transferred. My breath hitched in my throat, shallow and fast. The small, smoky room was suffocating, thick with the smell of wet wool, stale ale, and the unwashed bodies of a long day's festivities. Henrik's calloused fingers, thick as sausages and ridged with dirt, reached for the leather cord at the neck of my shift. His touch was not cool, not yet, but it was heavy, the touch of a man taking possession of a tool or a beast of burden. My mother's words came back to me, whispered in the dark hours before the dawn, a litany of warnings and duties. She had spoken of submission, of God's law and man's right. She had spoken of pain as a sacrament. But her hushed, frantic voice could not have prepared me for this. Nothing could. This was not a story of love. This was a bargain sealed in flesh, a transaction witnessed by a village hungry for proof. This was the reality of the year of our Lord, 1347. My world had been small, confined by the brook at the edge of the village and the deep woods where the wise woman Elspeth gathered her herbs. My mother had taught me the rhythms of this life, a tapestry woven with threads of prayer and fear. She taught me to read the saints' days on the church calendar, not for salvation, but for survival. Never on a Wednesday, Margot, she had whispered once, while we were shelling peas into a wooden bowl, her voice so low it was lost in the rattle of the pods. Nor a Friday, nor a Sunday. These are days for God, not for man's pleasure. She had shown me the almanac, pointing with a flour-dusted finger. And never, during the holy fast of Lent or the days of Advent, to do so is to lie with Satan himself. The list of forbidden times was a labyrinth. Not during the bleeding time, for a woman's blood was Eve's curse, a poison that could sour the wine and blight the new lambs. Not while with child, for it would mark the babe. Not while breastfeeding, for it would curdle the milk. I had counted them once, the permissible days. Barely 50 in a year. A sparse constellation of safety in a vast dark sky of sin. The village priest, Father Elquin, his face perpetually pinched with distaste for the sinful world he inhabited, reinforced these truths from the pulpit. He spoke of eternal hellfire for those who strayed, his words painting vivid pictures of demons and torment that haunted my sleep.
But my mother's teachings were a strange brew of the priest's doctrine and something older, something that smelled of damp earth and moonlight. The day before the wedding, she had pulled me behind the cottage, away from my father's hearing. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. From a fold in her skirts, she produced a small, gnarled root, vaguely shaped like a man. "A mandrake," she breathed, pressing it into my palm. Its skin was cool and strangely yielding. "From Elspeth. Keep it against your skin. It will quicken your womb, ensure a son." She looked over her shoulder, her body tense. "The priest would call it witchcraft. I call it a mother's prayer." She taught me the other things, too. The bitter teas of tansy and pennyroyal, whispered about by women at the village well, the herbs that could bring on a late bleeding. She spoke of them with a terror that surpassed even her fear of God, for the line between a contraceptive draught and a fatal poison was thinner than a spider's thread. This was the knowledge of women, a secret scripture written in pain and passed down in whispers. Henrik's courtship had been a matter of livestock and land boundaries. I saw him twice before the priest bound us. Once at the market, where he stared at me as he might a promising heifer, his eyes assessing my hips for childbearing potential. The second time, he came to our cottage with my father. They sat by the fire, drinking ale and hammering out the terms of my life, while I served them bread and cheese, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. I was a thread in a tapestry they were weaving, a vessel for a future heir, a pair of hands for the farm. My own heart, my own fears, were of no more consequence than the rustling of mice in the thatch. The wedding itself was a blur of public ritual. The priests droning Latin, the solemn exchange of vows I barely understood, and then the bedding ceremony. A tide of neighbors and kin, their faces flushed with ale, had swept us from the church to this cottage, their songs growing bawdier with every step. They had undressed me, their hands rough and their jokes like stones thrown against my skin. They had undressed Henrik, too, cheering at the sight of his broad, hairy chest. They laid us in the bed, pulled the scratchy wool blanket over us, and then retreated, their laughter and the banging of pots a wall of sound just beyond the door. They were the witnesses, the enforcers. They had a right to be here. In this world, the marriage bed was never private. It was a public stage, and the performance was about to begin. Now, in the stinking, claustrophobic quiet between the shouts from outside, Henrik's hand paused its journey. He looked at me, truly looked at me, for the first time. His eyes, the color of wet slate, held not the leering hunger I had dreaded, but a kind of weary resignation. He too was a performer in this brutal play. "They will not leave," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a threat, but a statement of fact. A shared sentence. I could only nod, my throat locked tight. He pulled the cord, and the shift loosened around my shoulders. He was not gentle, but he was not violent. His movements were functional, like a farmer tending to his chores. He smelled of sweat, soil, and the sour tang of ale. I squeezed my eyes shut, reciting the Ave Maria in my head, a frantic, silent prayer. I tried to make myself small, to retreat to some hidden corner of my mind where his touch could not find me. I braced for the searing pain my mother had promised, the necessary tearing that would make me a wife. He moved over me, his weight immense, pressing the air from my lungs. The straw-filled mattress rustled and groaned. Outside, a cheer went up, followed by a fresh round of banging. The sound was a violation, stripping away the last sliver of myself. The act was swift, clumsy, and brutal. It was a collision of flesh, a grunting effort in the dark. There was pain, yes, a hot, grinding pressure, but it was a dull, shameful thing, not the sharp, validating agony I had been led to expect. It ended as abruptly as it began. He rolled off me, his breathing heavy in the silence. The din outside subsided into a low, expectant murmur. The worst was over. I lay there, feeling a hollow ache between my legs, a sticky dampness on my thighs. My prayer had been answered. I had submitted. I had survived. Henrik lit a splinter from the candle and leaned over the bed, pulling back the woolen blanket and the linen sheet beneath it. He held the light low, his brow furrowed in concentration. His breath caught. "God's teeth!" he muttered, the words a puff of white in the cold air. I pushed myself up on my elbows, my heart beginning to hammer a panicked rhythm against my ribs. In the flickering, uncertain light, the sheet was pristine, white, unblemished. There was no blood. The world tilted. The shouts outside seemed to fade, replaced by a roaring in my ears. No blood. The word was a death knell. A woman who did not bleed was no virgin. A woman who was no virgin was a whore. Her marriage was a fraud. She could be sent back to her father in disgrace, her dowry forfeit, her family's name ruined, or worse. I had heard tales of girls stoned in the village square for less. I don't understand, I whispered, the word small and useless. My mother had been so certain. The priest had been so certain. Virginity was a seal, a physical barrier that must be broken. Its absence was absolute proof of sin. They did not know, could not comprehend that some women are simply made differently, that the proof they demanded was a phantom. Henrik stared at the sheet, and then at me. The weariness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp fear that mirrored my own. This was not just my shame, it was his. He had been sold damaged goods. His friends, his family, the entire village waiting just outside the door would know it. He would be a laughingstock. The man who married a harlot, or worse, a man unable to perform his duty. Impotence was a public humiliation, a stain on a man's honor as deep as any a woman could suffer. "He are still there," he said, his voice flat. He gestured with his head toward the door. We could hear them shuffling, whispering, waiting for the final act, the presentation of the blooded sheet. We were trapped. Two strangers bound together not by vows, but by a shared imminent catastrophe. His reputation and my life lay there on that clean, white sheet. In that moment, he was not my husband, and I was not his wife. We were conspirators, our enemy, the entire world, just on the other side of a flimsy wooden door. The fear was a living thing in the room, coiling in the space between us, colder and sharper than the autumn night. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I saw my father's face, contorted with rage. I saw the villagers' eyes filled with contempt and accusation. I saw the stones in their hands. My breath came in ragged sobs, and I pulled the blanket to my chin, a useless shield. Henrik stood, his large form pacing the small space, 3 steps one way, 3 steps the other. The floorboards creaked under his weight. The sounds from outside grew impatient, a low jeer, a questioning call. "Henrik, is the sow bled?"
His head snapped up, his jaw tightened, the muscles bunching under his skin. For a terrible moment, I saw a flicker of pure fury in his eyes, and I knew he could kill me. The law would allow it. A husband had the right. He could drag me out by the hair, declare me a fraud, and let the village have its justice. My life was balanced on the razor's edge of his pride. He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable in the guttering light. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. I held my breath, waiting for the verdict. Then, in a movement so swift it startled me, he strode to the corner where a small wooden cage sat. Inside was a chicken, a gift for our first morning's meal. He unlatched the cage, reached in, and pulled the bird out. It squawked in protest, a frantic, terrified sound. With one powerful twist of his hands, he broke its neck. The sound was sickeningly dull, a soft snap that echoed the crackling of the rushes. The bird went limp. My mind, numb with fear, struggled to understand. He wasn't coming for me. He took the small knife from his belt, the one he used for skinning rabbits, and carried the dead chicken to the bed. He looked at me, his gaze intense. There was no kindness in it, no pity. It was the look of a man solving a practical, desperate problem. He was saving himself, and by extension, he was saving me. He held the bird over the linen sheet, the one we had lain upon, and with a quick, practiced slice, he cut its throat. A stream of dark, hot blood poured onto the white cloth, soaking in, spreading into a damning, beautiful stain. It was far more blood than I could ever have produced, a garish, theatrical declaration, an undeniable proof. He smeared it with his thumb, making it look authentic, chaotic. He dropped the bird's carcass onto the floor and wiped the knife on his breeches. He looked from the bloodied sheet to me. A silent understanding passed between us, an unspoken pact forged in terror and sealed with the blood of a fowl. We were partners in a lie that had just saved my life. He picked up the sheet, holding it by the corners. He took a deep breath like a man about to dive into icy water and strode to the door. He threw the bolt back. The door swung open, revealing a crowd of eager, drunken faces, ruddy in the torchlight. A hush fell as they saw the sheet in his hands. He held it up high, displaying the dark, wet stain for all to see.
A roar of approval went up from the crowd. They cheered, they stamped their feet, they raised their ale mugs to him. Henrik, the potent husband. Henrik, the master of his house. He stood there, stoic and grim, accepting their congratulations. No one looked at me, cowering in the bed. I was irrelevant now. The proof had been presented. The transaction was complete.
They finally dispersed, their voices and laughter fading down the muddy track toward their own homes, leaving behind only the smell of spilled ale and the reen silence of our shared deceit. Henrik closed the door, slid the bolt home, and the world shrank back to the four walls of our cottage. He didn't look at me. He simply blew out the candle, plunging the room into absolute darkness. He lay down on the far side of the bed, turning his back to me. The space between us was a chasm, a cold, empty expanse, but for the first time it felt less like a threat and more like a truce. In the dark, I clutched the mandrake root hidden in my shift. I had not bled, but I had survived. And I understood that in this world, survival was its own kind of prayer. The seasons turned. The harsh winter gave way to a wet, muddy spring, and then a summer of relentless work under a pale sun. The memory of that first night remained, a secret cornerstone upon which our life was built. Henrik and I spoke little. Our days were filled with the rhythms of the farm, the sowing of the barley, the feeding of the pigs, the mending of the fences. Our nights were governed by the strange silent pact we had made. We followed the church's rules with a piety that earned Father Alcuin's grudging approval. We did not touch on the forbidden days. Our couplings were infrequent, functional, and always performed in the one sanctioned position, man on top, woman beneath, a tableau of duty, not desire. There was no pleasure in it, only a shared, grim purpose. We were creating an heir, fulfilling our part of the bargain. But in the quiet moments, something shifted. I saw the way his hands, though rough, could be gentle with a newborn lamb. I saw the exhaustion in his shoulders after a day of scything the fields that would feed us. He never spoke of that night, but sometimes when he thought I wasn't looking, I would see him glance at the hearth where the chicken had been cooked, a flicker of something, shame or perhaps just memory in his eyes. Our silence was not empty. It was filled with the weight of our shared secret. It was a strange and brittle foundation, but it was a foundation nonetheless. One evening, As the autumn chill began to creep back into the air, I felt the familiar sickness in my belly. My monthly bleeding, always as regular as the moon, did not come. For a week, I lived in a state of quiet terror and hope. I held the mandrake root, its surface worn smooth from a year of handling, and prayed to a god I wasn't sure I knew, the god of the priest or the older, wilder god of Elsbeth's forest. When I finally told Henrik, his face remained impassive. He only nodded and placed an extra log on the fire, a small practical acknowledgement that our conspiracy had borne fruit. Our lie was about to be made flesh. 9 months later, after a day and night of screaming agony that dwarfed the memory of my wedding night, I gave birth. Not to the son Henrik had bargained for, but to a daughter, her face red and crumpled, her cries thin but furious. Henrik came into the cottage, smelling of the barn. He looked at the baby girl cradled in my arms, and for a moment I saw a flicker of disappointment. Another daughter to be married off, another dowry to be found. Then he looked at me, lying exhausted and sweat-soaked on the bed. He saw not the failed vessel, but the survivor. He reached out a calloused finger and gently touched the baby's cheek. She was proof, not of my virginity, but of our survival. She was the living embodiment of our lie, a testament to a dead chicken and a husband's desperate, pragmatic choice. He turned and left without a word, but a few moments later he returned with a bowl of warm broth. He set it beside the bed. It was more than he had ever given me. It was not love, not as the troubadours sang of it in their fanciful tales, but it was something. It was the quiet acknowledgement of a debt, a shared hardship, a life forged not in passion, but in the cold, hard soil of necessity. I looked down at my daughter, sleeping against my breast. I thought of the world she had been born into, a world of rules designed to chain her, of superstitions meant to terrify her. I thought of the secrets I would have to teach her, the priest's calendar and the wise woman's herbs, the performance of piety and the necessity of lies. I would teach her, as my mother had taught me, how to navigate the treacherous currents between damnation and survival. Her life would be a battlefield, just as mine was. But as I held her close, I felt not despair, but a fierce, defiant strength. We were a line of women, passing down not a woolen shroud of fear, but a hidden, resilient knowledge. We would endure.